right? What I sort of wanted to talk about is like these ideas are sort of relevant, I feel, for all startups, but sort of more relevant in the early stage startup. So, in the first 2 or 3 stages, right? And so who is this for? I honestly feel this is for everybody who is in product. And and I know, like, we've been taught like, oh, like product managers are the CEO of the product and product is king. And I think the talk sort of revolves around the aspect that yes, product is king, but there's all these other things that you need to think about from a product management standpoint. And many times, the product managers themselves are not thinking about it. So you as a product leader need to think about it. So think about, system level thinking, business strategy, hiring. So I think that's the idea. And again, like, as we work with startups, many of, they don't even have product leaders, right? Your senior product manager is your product leader or the product person. So again, having, I just feel like it's relevant for everybody who's sort of dealing with in the startup product management ecosystem. So the first sort of lesson that I learned was sort of, understanding what business are you in, right? So do you sell elephants or mice, right? Like that's the sort of the first lesson, right? And so what does that mean, right? And so this is sort of, if you haven't seen it, this is sort of like a great graphic around a SaaS business. Is sort of saying, how do you sort of build $100 million SaaS business, right? And so there's several ways of building a $100 million SaaS business. And again, don't focus on the SaaS part. It could be any business, right? You could sort of build a $100 million business by sort of charging 10 million people $10 each, like, or like Netflix does, or you could sort of be at the other end of the spectrum and charge, 100 customers $1 million each, right? And so the idea here is most startups, when they're thinking about product, the goal should be, as a product leader, to sort of understand where you fit in this spectrum. Like understand, what are you sort of selling, right? And then what we sort of see is with startups is, they start off somewhere and they sort of scale, like, scale up or down. It's sometimes they want to, everybody wants to scale down. So you want to have lesser customers paying more money, especially in the B2B space. But the core idea here is to sort of figure out where you sort of stand, and then sort of sticking to it, right? I think we've seen where startups try to go after two different customer segments at the same time, and we've seen them fail, right? So really sticking to one is the key idea. And so why is it sort of important, right? And what we sort of found is like, if you're selling elephants, right? Like there's a bunch of questions you need to ask. And what we sort of found is like the product managers, right, like are really good at asking questions like, hey, if somebody wants to buy an elephant, like what do the users expect? And like, how long does it take to make, right? Like, I think those sort of, like, so user level questions, getting the product built, those are the questions that product managers, senior product managers are good at. I think what they do not ask, I guess, or try to analyze is sort of who's buying these elephants, why are they buying, and sort of thinking at a higher level. And product leaders, I think we expect them to do it. And like almost sort of very few product leaders sort of try to answer the last question and say, how long does it take to actually sell one? And as we are sort of going into the product-led growth world, we see a lot more sort of emphasis on sort of understanding these questions. And the more questions are answered, we feel like the company and the product and the startup is at a better place. So like, I am not very smart, so I usually learn by actually doing stuff. So I thought I would at least give you an example each of the lesson that I've learned. So we did some analysis for, like, we had a company that was in the life sciences spaces, and who like they wanted to sell elephants, right? They wanted to sell $100,000 ACV. ACV stands for average contract value, right? And so what you as a product leader could be doing is sort of, you're saying, hey, I want to be in this space. I want to sell 100,000. Sort of look and profile companies that are also doing that. So you could sort of start looking. So we sort of looked at several companies that were selling $100,000 ACVs. And these are the companies. And we sort of also figured out, how they were making 100,000. So if you look on the top, they were making 100,000 in ACV by sort of consumption. So, the more cloud services you use, the more security you use, the more they charge you. And they were able to get, an average customer to pay 100,000 there. The bottom ones were sort of doing it by adding more users, right? And so the company that we sort of anchored on was Viva. And it was because they weren't selling that many users and wasn't a lot of consumption, but they were providing a lot of value and they were able to charge a lot more. So even having 5 users, 10 users, they were able to charge 100,000. And our client was similar. So once we were able to sort of isolate and anchor on that company, we were able to learn a lot more about their business and how they actually went about, doing what they did. And that sort of helped our startup sort of understand and set not only our business strategy, but more so on product strategy. And so like there's several metrics that you can sort of look at, but just share a simple metric, sort of LTV. I know most of you guys know it, but if not, it's like the lifetime value. Like the basic business metric is, the lifetime value of your customer should be greater than the cost of acquisition, right? Like that's like business 101, saying, hey, what it takes you to acquire a customer and, what value, or how much money you get from it, that needs to be more than what it takes you to acquire. And so we sort of analyze how they were going about selling. And so if you look at Viva, like it's at the bottom, right? So for every $100,000 in revenue at a high level, they were sort of spending $15,000. And like at the top was like Hortonworks, that for every sort of 15,000, every sort of 100,000, they had to sell $133,000. So what that meant was, in order for them to break even, they required the customer to stay on board for at least 15 months, 18 months. And so that's not like, and so if they acquired a customer and the customer left in a year, they made a loss, right? And so when we sort of dug deeper and looked into more and more, not just at a product level, but to understand the whole business, we were able to get a lot of insights about what they were doing right and what they were doing wrong on the product side. So again, as a product leader, I highly encourage you to look at it, understand what business you are. And like, if you just look at the stock, all of them went IPO. So sort of, if you look at it's sort of indicator of how they were doing as a business was sort of, clearly sort of reflected in their stock price. One, Aviva going strength to strength, and Hortonworks, not doing so well. So lesson number one, sort of for product leaders, is sort of understand what business you are in. Lesson number two that we learned is it's all about customer outcomes, right? We like to think, it's all about the product, and nobody cares, right? Like one of my sort of mentors sort of told me, like, every entrepreneur, every product manager he sees, like, they put their product in the middle of the slide. And so saying, hey, this is my product, how important it is. But really what he said was, like, nobody really cares. What you need to be is, like, your product should be a cog in the whole sort of machine of your customer's environment. And the better you are sort of stuck into that machine, you're more sticky you are, right? So I think as a product leader, we need to sort of tell our team, like, hey, you need to focus on customer outcomes. And there's 2 or 3 things about it I wanted to talk about, and a lot to unpack here. So this is what, this is like a product slide that we see. Oh, nobody cares about like a 1/4-inch drill. They want a 1/4-inch hole, right? Like, I honestly, like, I don't really know who wants a 1/4-inch hole, right? Like, I don't, I want, like, and literally that's what I was sort of doing. I want to hang a picture frame that my wife told me about. And yesterday afternoon, after ProductCamp, actually my wife wanted me to hang some curtains, right? And I was glad I had a drill, right? And the outcome was hang curtains. But when I was in India, right, like, if my mom would have asked me, I would have actually called a handyman, because that's the product and service that works there, like, so much cheaper, right? And so we sort of need to think about outcomes, and it's always about outcomes. That's sort of the first one. The second one, this is like learn the hard way. It's the buyer of the product and the user of the product, especially in the B2B scenarios, are different. And what is sort of important for us to understand as product leaders is like outcomes vary, right? Like, so the outcome that the buyer is looking for might be significantly different than what the user is looking for. In many cases, they might be the same, but in many cases, they might be different. And, understanding those are really, really important for you to sort of then sort of have a proper product. And so we learned it the hard way. So and then the sort of the third thing is sort of all related, is the perceived value is proportional to the outcome, right? And again, it's very important to understand whose outcome is being measured, and whose outcome is in many cases, we found the outcome of the buyer, not necessarily the user, matters more, right? And so understanding as a product leader, understanding what outcome is important helps you sort of figure out, how you sort of build your product. And so I'll give you a real life example. So as this is was my second startup, we were sort of building a smart building solution, right? Like our goal was sort of, we were like early, this was 2009, 2010, before Alexa days. We were sort of building a sort of a web-based smart building solution. What that meant was now users of the buildings could, say, hey, turn on the lights. You could turn the lights on, have your HVAC stuff, your heating and air conditioning, all be controlled through a web interface. And like we were doing a lot of stuff, and like traditionally it was being done by using, like old technology, and we sort of reinvented, in a way of doing it wirelessly, right? And blah, blah, blah. Like at the end of the day, what happened was, right, like the only way to sort of sell into the building space was through these facility managers and energy managers, right? And so our pitch, although we were doing a lot of good things for the users, our pitch was always like, hey, save electricity, save money, right? So we would go into them because these managers did not really care about end user outcomes. They cared more about, hey, how can I save energy? How can I save, save money, right? And so what ended up happening was our perceived value of the solution was always a percentage of how much money we saved them on electricity. Although we were sort of having our end users who were using the software that were allowed to sort of, change their lights, set their schedules, their productivity was going up significantly. That did not matter. Did not matter to our buyer because he or she was not responsible for that. Right? And so we were always in this struggle of sort of saying, hey, like we're providing all this tremendous value, but it just, they would not care because they're like, oh, save me more energy, save me more, because that's the metric that they were focused on as buyer. So we as a company had to sort of think about how can we sort of change, not like, we sort of analyzed saying, hey, what outcomes were happening? And we then said, who's sort of tied directly to the end user outcomes? And what we sort of pitched and what we sort of decided was, we really had to shift our thinking and our product to sort of, from moving from energy into productivity, right? And so now we were no longer pitching an energy efficiency solution. We were now pitching a smart building solution with higher productivity. And what happened was this completely changed the focus from the energy manager that was looking at a 50,000 energy utility bill to the CEO who was looking at, the payroll cost, right? And so we were now a percentage of the payroll cost, and we were sort of, seen as, essential. And honestly, that thinking of sort of understanding the outcomes and how they are tied helped us sort of, make that switch, both as a startup and as a product. And eventually, over the next 3 years, we were able to accelerate and got $100 million exit, right? And I wouldn't just attribute it to just one switch, but just understanding the outcomes was really important to us, and understanding how buyer and user outcomes might be different. So that's lesson number 2. And so the final lesson I have, I'm just checking my time, is sort of price. We understood the business. We understand it's all about outcomes. And the third one is price, right? And so like life, price evolves. So what you want to do is, as a startup, is sort of test, rinse, and repeat. And so when we go into a lot of startups, it's like pricing. We say, what's happening, and how did you come up with price? And the reality is, it's just a lot of conjecture, a lot of just looking at stuff and just coming up with, oh, my competition did this, right? And like what we sort of recommend is, or like at least my experience is, sort of just have to, as a product leader, just understand that it's going to change. You don't want to go and overanalyze stuff, right? And so I think what I want to sort of leave you with is sort of, as like, this is how I see startups, and again, I know, everybody has their own view of looking at it, but, if you look at it as an early stage, right, like you're an MVP to product market fit, like the goal there is really not to optimize on price, right? Like the goal there is to sort of get to product market fit, understand the problems you want to solve. So why are you sort of spending time trying to sort of, spending your brain cycles looking at pricing? Once you do have product market fit, that's when as you go into the repeatable sales process, that's where you want to sort of optimize on your price. So again, the lesson here is, if you're going to spend any sort of brain cycles, like significant brain cycle, you don't want to be completely off, right? Like from the first, depending on what business you are in, you should have a good idea where you want to be selling. But then again, if you were to sort of optimize your price, I would recommend doing it in this step, right? In the repeatable sales process, because once you have, you understand what the customer wants from a product market fit, you have a good sales process. Now you're ready to go into the growth phase where, you're ready to just go without having to sort of do adjustments. Because, once you're in the growth phase, it's like, it's like everything's falling apart. You're like growing like crazy. So you basically want to sort of have established some of these things before. And so again, like I not have any sort of pricing data that I could share publicly. So I just thought I'll just use Zoom as an example, because all of us are on Zoom. I think if you get nothing out of this talk, I think one thing as a product manager, as a product leader, I think is an invaluable resource is Wayback Machine, right? Like Wayback Machine is sort of the best thing that as a product manager, as a product leader who's trying to understand strategy. So what they do is sort of archive, websites, and you can go back and look at websites, how they were, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's a free resource, right? So again, I just pulled some screenshots out from Zoom, in the MVP stage, in the product market fit stage. And if you look at it, right, like in 2017, they were in the sort of the repeatable sales process stage. And if you look, like the pricing that they sort of nailed down is, I think, is still consistent today, right? So again, I think you want to spend time, but sort of, have the concept that it is going to evolve. So to wrap it up, again, like lesson number one, understand what business you are in, make sure to have your product team align on that, spend some time there. It's always about customer outcomes. So make sure that, you are achieving the customer outcomes you have. And then third, price. It's price, like life evolves. That was me. I'm more than happy to take any sort of questions.
Aniket, I wanted to hop in and just, I did post this in our little Slack chat, but I also love Wayback Machine. And I use it for two reasons. One, coming in as a product marketer, you want to understand how you've marketed things in the past and be able to identify inconsistencies in the evolution of things. So that's really helpful. But also, I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, where you just have a loss, you'll have a huge loss of tribal knowledge. And a lot of things are on Wayback Machine that nobody in your business happens to really know anymore.
Yep.
And so I agree. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. It's a really cool tool.
Awesome. Yeah. And I again, I think a lot of early stage startups, right? There's so many things you can learn. if you're a marketplace, like go check out all the marketplaces and like try to figure out, how they sort of grew. It has a lot of information for you to sort of understand, like, like, hey, you're Uber for product managers. Okay, let's go check out, Uber. How did Uber website look like? What verticals they were going after? What product offerings did they have? And then see, does Uber for product managers need to be like Uber, or does a different marketplace, make more sense, like a TaskRabbit? Now go check their website out, and like, what were they doing? What were they talking about? So a lot of insights there. Am I sort of supposed to look at the Slack? I don't know if there are any sort of questions.
Hey, Aniket, while you're looking that up, right, this is Archana. First of all, thank you for the great session. That was pretty awesome with the examples there. The question I had was, and every time, startups, it's like you're exploring an idea. How do you actually go about with customer research? What are some best practices you suggest to make sure that the idea is worth taking forward?
So I think, thank you. And I think like the sort of, I guess my best advice is sell it before you build it. And that's what I've sort of learned. And everything's not possible to sort of sell before you build, but I think this is what I would recommend. Like, everybody has different sort of benchmarks, but I feel that you should talk to at least 20 to 30 people, right? And like in B2B world, it might be harder to get that many, but I think 20 to 30 is sort of a good number. But like, if there was a sort of a threshold, like what you should see is you should hear the same ideas over and over again, right? Like, so if you hear the same pain points over and over again, and now you're able to cluster them, that's when you sort of stop. If you're talking to 50 people and like you're getting 50 different things, then you're not solving the right problem.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you.
Hi, I have a quick question. I was wondering, you talked about how obviously sometimes the user and the buyer aren't the same person necessarily. And so when you're developing a product and you've identified the pain points of a customer and you've seen the trend, done the user research, what is the best way to test out different revenue models and know like what people will pay for? Because that's something I'm struggling right now currently.
Yeah, and like I think the way I sort of, and like B2B versus B2C is sort of different, but like in my experience, right? Like I've spent most of my time in the B2B world. I sort of like the way I sort of look at it is, in most cases, the problem you're solving is not a new problem. Like that's what I feel, right? Like, so like the problem you're solving is being solved today. It's just been solved by a different solution, right? So that should be your benchmark. So as an example, we just like, I think it was last week, we were sort of trying to price this new software that is going to help in drug commercialization, right? And the norm today for drug commercialization is to hire a consulting service and sort of do it, right? And that cost about $80,000, right? And so we are like, okay, like today, if our customers want to do something, it is $80,000, right? Like now, what we are sort of doing is we are sort of doing it faster. We are doing it, better, because now it's not human dependent, and then we need to say, okay, if you're doing it faster and better, then we can sort of be comparable. I honestly think you need to be 10x on one sort of value, right? So you're either cheaper or you're sort of better. Otherwise, it's just hard to get a product. So if in your case, if you are 10x better than something, then you can say, okay, I'm going to charge the same price or even more. But if you're only incrementally better, then it's sort of hard to sort of charge the same price. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Is there a process you use in your company to go from concept to launch? I would say yes. The first thing we sort of do is, and any new sort of product is try to sort of understand, like, what problem are we solving, right? And like, who are we solving it for? And try to sort of go down that. And before even coming into the solution space, honestly, like, I personally feel like if I'm not disciplined enough, I try to suggest solutions even before sort of, spending enough time in the problem space. So I think once we sort of understand the problems, we sort of do customer development. We sort of talk to a lot of customers, validate our assumptions, then prototype it. Then we sort of go back, validate, saying, hey, does this make sense, before we write a single line of code. And like, even for hardware products, because we also deal with hardware products. So, using 3D printing or, whatever is, I would say, before actually building anything, validate your assumptions as early as possible. I hope that helps. With B2B, if you get into, as long as there's no risk of, I don't know if it's a question. What is your producer on who to focus on as a customer, buyer versus users? In other words, how do you compare, prioritize the outcomes? So I think the process is, ideally you want to have, like, you don't want to sort of change your product just, because the buyer is different. I think you still want to target the user. You still want to sort of, solve the right problem, right? Like, you don't want to solve a problem for the buyer just because, that person is the buyer. But what we sort of learned, right? Like in the second example, what we ended up learning was we never changed our core product. We were still a smart building solution. We were still saving energy. But what we did was we had to sort of build dashboards, and we had to build apps that sort of explain to our buyer, why productivity mattered. So, like, one of our clients ended up being a Fortune 500 company, and once we identified productivity was a problem, we sort of then spent understanding how our solutions could help on productivity. And one of the use cases that we found was, they had a very, like, for every 100 people, they had like 2 conference rooms, and people would struggle to, book conference rooms and find the right conference room. So because we had a smart building solution, we were able to solve that problem. And it had nothing to do with energy efficiency, but had to do everything about productivity. And we were able to then build that application and then sort of show it to the buyer, saying, hey, we are truly sort of helping solve the productivity problem, and we are not, no longer just an energy efficient solution. So again, I'd say you still want to solve the right problems, but then sort of, it's still your job as a product team to sort of help the sales team sell the solution, and then help and understand, what is it going to take to sort of sell your product, right? Like, because I honestly think of it as, like a product being the baby, right? Like, for people who are parents like me, like, I do not say, like, I'm responsible for my child, right? So if I see a bad friend, a bad teacher, I do not say that, oh, that's not my job, like, it's our job, right? Like, it's our job to sort of have our baby be successful. So whatever it takes.